Hi, I'm Woody Lewis. Today we'll talk about making your living as a technical writer. I've been a digital media producer, applications developer, and solutions architect, working at Cisco Systems, IBM, Yahoo, and Stanford University. Most recently, I worked at Time Inc. on a team that included technical writers using the latest tools. As it turns out, I wrote an article in September 2005 for the AWP Career Advice article series called Technical Writing, Growth Industry for Sharp Minds. At the time, we were at a first phase of transition from the traditional model of this business. The Post.com reaction to this new process produced an evolution of approach to job seeking. I personally experienced this. Technical writing covers a lot of ground. The Society for Technical Communication defines it as communicating about technical or specialized topics, communicating through technology, or providing instructions about how to do something, regardless of the task's technical nature. Why technical writing? Today's technology encapsulates a series of narratives. Creative writers make good storytellers. A significant portion of technical documentation is anecdotal. It's an industry enthralled to its practitioners. That last sentence gets mangled in many traditional technical shops. Open source frameworks emphasize publicly available information, requiring more writers to communicate that information. Financial security is a big reason that shouldn't go overlooked for creative writers considering technical writing. Given the entry-level salaries for academic jobs these days, technical writing offers a measure of financial security and also opportunities for advancement. Many industries hire technical writers. High tech, of course, specifically software companies and companies called vendors that sell platforms to corporations, financial institutions, medical and healthcare organizations, manufacturing companies, general businesses, academic institutions, and nonprofit organizations. A creative writer brings strengths to technical writing, specifically a sense of craft. We really can't overlook the importance of the discipline we acquired in our MFA programs because it's not a universal trait. We have a sense of narrative and a sense of unity, knowing the whole that results from assembling the pieces of a narrative. We have patience and we have imagination. The ability to visualize is not widespread. There are challenges that we face as creative writers when considering a career in technical writing. The culture is different. Both the traditional culture, involving development teams working on large projects, either software-related or product-related, and the so-called AGILE process, which we'll discover later, can rely on new talents that you really didn't expect to have in a writing career. Another challenge is the narrow focus that sometimes exists in a very intense technical project rendered by a team that does not have a widespread view of life. There can also be an ad hoc process where the organizational details change from day to day. And I think most important, a measure of technical fluency, which is not as imposing as it might sound. The idea that one person knows everything is an idea whose time has come. Even the most accomplished developer or programmer cannot know everything these days. But I think the challenge a creative writer faces is knowing where to start in acquiring technical knowledge. Generally, the way to succeed in technical writing depends on certain attributes. Personality cannot be overemphasized. I think the idea of an independent creative writer working in solitude, as we all like to do, is somewhat antithetical to the idea of a creative writer working on a team. Yes, there is technical proclivity, which is important not so much for specific technical details, but for the idea that you are receptive to technical ideas and you have somewhat of a technical orientation. Not, again, a technical background with an engineering degree per se, although those that have that background might have an advantage, but a receptivity to technical ideas. Being a subject matter expert is definitely an advantage. There are a lot of companies that look for people with specific experience in financial services, in healthcare, in academic areas. And I think cultural flexibility also, not in the sense of diverse cultures per se, but the culture of technology in general really does not exist in parallel with many of the academic cultures we're accustomed to. Finally, knowledge of tools, I think, is important, although this is also a moving target. There are so many new tools being produced every month that, above all, the knowledge of currency of these tools is most important. Entry-level salaries for technical writers probably look very attractive to people considering academic careers. These are numbers from salary.com, which is one of several widespread trackers of financial information for entry-level salaries. We see that for a person with 0 to 2 years experience, there is a curve that on the low end touches what might be considered a high-level academic salary number, I think going up to a medium level for many corporate jobs, and then tailing off on the high end to, I think, some very generous salaries. These are jobs that typically do not require much management, and I think this is important also for someone first starting out in technical writing, because a creative writer really might not be a manager unless the idea of being an editor is driving the decision. Certainly there are editors in technical writing, but I think the idea that an entry-level writer really is going to be taking instruction from a manager who might also function as an editor. Salaries for experienced technical writers are clearly higher, and they're really on par with salaries for a certain class of actual programmers or application developers. Typically, in this case, there is a certain degree of managerial responsibility, although the experienced technical writer might be reporting to a manager or unit head. But the idea of working on a team and using a broader base of experience than entry level certainly factors into the higher salary. One example job listing on LinkedIn from a financial institution shows the importance of making that cultural adjustment. The idea that you're going to be creating and managing technical, end user, and regulatory documentation alone shows the different facets of this type of job. Technical documentation is different than regulatory documentation, and financial institutions especially, along with healthcare institutions, require writing that covers this whole range of subject matter. We see mention of agile and waterfall development environments. We'll cover those shortly, but the whole idea is that these are differing development environments that represent that transition from traditional that I mentioned earlier. This particular position shows 5 years experience as a requirement. Certainly that's always flexible. I think the idea that the business itself is going to know the individual they think will succeed. And here we also see mention of tools such as Microsoft Office, SharePoint, and others. I'm going to recommend familiarity with several broadly based tools in widespread usage. There is no way to know all the tools that you might encounter. I think being familiar with those tools and certainly doing research before any interview or conversation is important. Another example listing, also from LinkedIn, from a technical company, shows under qualifications knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JS. Now, these acronyms are part of the framework that any technical writer will encounter. HTML is familiar to most of us, and the actual use of HTML is really not the essential requirement here, but knowledge of that and how it interacts with CSS or cascading style sheets and JS or JavaScript. Again, this is not to imply that these are skills that need to be fully built out by the technical writer, but there are things that really make it easier to produce the documentation. And I think the idea that HTML is something we all know, or at least might have encountered, should give us some comfort. And certainly the idea that the other frameworks, such as JavaScript, really are these days more prevalent as descriptors of what's happening in the technical process, and certainly the idea to communicate with programmers when necessary to learn how specific pieces of code or programming languages might be used is essential. Again, though, I think at the bottom of this job listing, the idea that the ideal personality has an open, positive, can-do attitude, that sounds a little hokey to someone who's used to creative writing, but it really is a case of going with the flow and understanding that the organizational culture, and we'll talk about culture later, has a large part to do with success. The enterprise we define, for the sake of technical writing, as any organization, whether it's a corporation, an academic institution, or a nonprofit organization that produces a product or service. Within that enterprise, we define 3 areas of functionality: development, which is the actual software development or programming process, which we break down in traditional and agile; product; and marketing communication. Traditional development was known by some as the systems development lifecycle, or software development lifecycle by others today. The so-called waterfall model of sequential design began with requirement specification, design, implementation, or what we call coding, testing, installation, and maintenance. The waterfall metaphor has to do with the flow from one portion of the process to another in an orderly fashion. Traditional development bears in mind the user's manual that we all know and love, and producing that manual involves studying the product during and after development cycle, interviewing the constituency that produces the product, the developers, the product managers, the marketers, writing and editing drafts, using desktop applications to integrate content and layout, and finally delivering the product for physical and digital distribution. In the old days, meaning about 10 or 15 years ago, technical writers used a program called FrameMaker to actually produce print-ready documents for user manuals. These are the kinds of user manuals that we're used to seeing, in this case, user guides for hardware, which really points out the idea that technical writing can relate to specific products and not just software. Taken to the extreme, these user manuals require a large measure of layout expertise, some of which will actually come from designers or artists on the project. But this is really a more traditional example of what we used to encounter. Certainly it still exists, and there are jobs that imply an awareness of this kind of format, but the more prevalent jobs today are not focused on this type of output. The agile development process began with something called the Manifesto for Software Development. In February 2001, a group of well-respected application developers and solutions architects in Silicon Valley created a statement in response to a number of issues arising in engagements, large and small, on various projects. Their statement that the traditional element of processes and tools was less important than the idea of individuals and interactions, less important than working software. Certainly comprehensive documentation was important, but the idea that the end goal was to produce software in collaboration with the customer, as opposed to the traditional idea of build it and they'll come, which was a function of contract negotiation. The Agile process involves responding to change, which is antithetical to the idea of following a plan in sequential fashion with little or no flexibility for change. As such, the interaction between technical writers and developers became that much more important. The developer discovers and builds out feature sets or the different pieces of functionality. Today, a technical writer working in an Agile framework is expected to build out epics to describe the interaction with those feature sets. Within those epics, the writer is expected to develop stories that show the breakdown of the feature sets into components that fit a developer delivery schedule. That schedule is broken up into periods called scrums, which facilitate actual development team activities called sprints. And these are tracked along a delivery schedule that drives developers towards the goal. Adapting to change is another important part of the Agile development process, as opposed to reacting to change. That's very important, and again, a feature of the personality needed to become a successful creative writer in the technical writing field. The interaction between technical writers and product managers is also very important. Product managers deliver the high-level feature design that technical writers incorporate into a product design document. The feature details, the actual workings of any particular piece of functionality, are recorded in a technical design document and also in wireframes that are produced by the UX or user experience staff on a development team. Wireframes are documents that show the skeletal structure of any particular web page or interface component of a product. The annotations relate to specific areas of the interface or web page where there might be a question about how the web developer or application developer builds that functionality. In this case, annotations are very important because they comprise a blueprint for application development. Marketing communication is the last piece of this framework involving interaction between technical writers and staff. The marketing staff produces features according to a priority of perceived customer demand. Technical writers, on occasion, are called on to produce user-friendly ad copy, perhaps in conjunction with an ad agency. In addition, online help copy, not just the frequently asked questions or FAQs on websites, but detailed user-friendly instructions to support the ad copy are essential. And then finally, that marketing communication content sometimes is revised as a result of contract negotiation or managerial decisions. But again, this is another element of flexibility in the idea of technical writing. There is a publishing ecosystem at work in technical writing. Ecosystem itself is a buzzword you'll find and you'll hear a lot. So again, the need to adapt to that culture. Project management tools, generally speaking, are broken down into collaborative and issue tracking and code revision or document revision systems. In this case, Confluence, Jira, and GitHub. Content management systems facilitate what we call workflow, or the structured writing and editing of documents in a context of collaborative team activity. Confluence is a standard wiki-based platform that facilitates communication among members of a team. You can see the different dashboards and user-directed functional areas that allow collaborative publication to a central space and controlled workflow. In this case, Confluence can track a project that might result in the end product of a separate freestanding document or a document on a web page or series of web pages. But the actual workflow itself, the collaborative publishing, the editing, and the iterating through tasks resides in the Confluence web platform. Jira is what we call a project tracking or issue management platform. And what it does is present a framework to identify specific issues. And in my experience, this includes topics or subjects that were open to revision, and then tracking the progress of the writer to accomplish documenting those different features. And this again is something that fits into a managerial process that's part of a culture of organizational team play. GitHub is a version control system that's really become a standard for programmers as well as some technical writers. It's an online resource that allows users to upload different versions of documents, including the actual files containing programming code, as they're rendered and as they're revised. As such, there's a way to control versions and also to do what we call branching and tagging, creating different, not just edited versions, but flows within a document. This is not something that technical writers will use as much as application developers, but certainly awareness of this tool will be part of any successful approach to a technical writing job opportunity. WordPress is probably the most popular content management system. It's in widespread use by individual bloggers as well as teams. In 2009, I wrote 5 pieces for the technology blog Mashable, which is in widespread use today, read by a lot of people. And I was part of a team of dozens of writers using the WordPress platform. It's got a fairly intuitive interface, and you really can configure the extent to which any user has control over editing, copying, and revising. Drupal is the most popular open source content management system with extended functionality. And by that I mean that it's got a number of different modules. In fact, they number into the thousands, produced by open source developers. These are developers that contribute their work to a common platform, and the modules can be used for all sorts of customizable workflow and to extend functionality in a website. The interface is not as intuitive, and there is a whole cottage industry around documenting Drupal functionality and workflow, but it's definitely something to know about, if only on a first degree of familiarity. A strategy to win, I think, is most important in looking for a job in technical writing. Prepare your knowledge, taking what you learn in this presentation, in your reading from day to day, and what you hear from people that are in the business or groups that get together to meet. There are meetups, there are a number of organizations in many cities where just the chance to be in a room and hear technical writers talk is really valuable. Preparing online samples of your work, I think, is essential. Even if you're starting out and you're doing something on the basis of a theoretical piece of technical writing, it's important to have that online presence. Branding yourself by creating a blog, whether it's on Tumblr, your own blog, or on the WordPress.com site, it's essential to have that because people need to see that you're part of the framework that you want to describe and document. And it's all about promoting yourself. this might not be an easy concept for the typical creative writer who might be accustomed to solitary effort, or the solitary writer that's gone to social media but still doesn't have that tendency to promote. That's essential in a very orderly manner. And the idea of using sources of work to promote yourself is most important. LinkedIn is something that's discussed very frequently as far as the pros and cons of using a job networking platform. Personally, I've really, since 2009, not used any other means or channel to procure all the full-time and contractual work that I've received. There are other sites such as Indeed and Hired.com that are good reference points for job opportunities. But I think the idea that you need to go beyond the sources of job listings is also very important. Again, networking, even on Facebook, to the extent that you encounter people that you know that beyond that particular framework can help you in your search. Internships, certainly there are a number of organizations, particularly nonprofit organizations, that look to the idea of people breaking in, improving their talent and their output in a context in which they're also learning and helping the organization to learn and grow. Internships are always a good way to break in. We had a couple of questions that came in when we announced this screencast, so I'll just go through what we got from a couple of people. The first set of questions involves what we all want to know about getting into the field. How would someone best position themselves to enter the technical writing field? Well, I think a summary of what we've talked about so far is most relevant, really acquiring the culture and the personality to go along with a reasonable learning process involving the basic technical ideas, knowing what HTML is, knowing what JavaScript is on a high level. I think that's a good way to not only dilute the discomfort of hearing those terms, but also in improving your skill set. Is it about the writing or about the tech or both? How technically involved does someone need to be to succeed as a technical writer? Well, again, this is an open-ended question. I had the fortune of being an application developer as well as a technical writer, so the relatively deep skill set I had was beneficial. But I think the most important thing to say is that it's not essential to be that technically proficient. You need to have some proclivity, as I said earlier, and attributes. But the idea is it's about the absorption, which is to say that it's about both the tech and the writing, but more importantly, it's about the open-mindedness to approach tech in a way that facilitates the writing. And this leads into the last question. Do you find it difficult to move between technical writing and creative writing, or is there a happy medium? Does the writing you do for work ever impact your creative output? And if so, how do you overcome that barrier? Well, this is the large question. I've been known to say that I go between the left brain and right brain aspect of my writing all the time. And I think the answer is that there's really not a happy medium. I think it's driven by the various projects you might be involved in, both on the technical side and creative side. On any given day, technical writing or application development might challenge my creative output. That's a very honest statement, and I overcome it by seeking balance in another part of my schedule. There's really no other way around meeting the short-term demands of a project deadline in either space, and I think the thing to remember is that getting balance, and this is obvious to some but not to everyone, is the key to making them both work. Another question is, I am graduating with an MFA from a certain program in January. I would like to be a technical writer in the finance sector, but I am a 56-year-old female with limited work experience outside of 6 years in banking and part-time jobs. I am doing an internship with a nonprofit, writing the manual for their new software. How else can I get experience to break into a completely new field at such a late age? The answer to that is that you are getting really good experience now doing an internship with that nonprofit. As I mentioned, that's a traditional area, traditional in the sense that people now working in the Agile framework have been doing this for years. And certainly the idea that you're doing this today, right now, in my mind, does not work against you, it works for you. I would caution against thinking about how late you are to the game. You know, there's no need to go into, at this point, the idea that working in a field is a function of your talent and your willingness to learn. What I would specifically say as well, that your experience in banking would be a possible foundation for financial writing in the technical sense, that I would definitely inventory your skills, modify your resume and LinkedIn presence if you have one, and I think that would be essential to get one, because the other thing about the online resources, this is extremely important, is that they are mined by recruiters looking for the use of certain keywords. That's something really important to emphasize, is that everything today is online. If you're not online in some way with at least a summary of your talents and skills, if not an actual listing, then you're not taking advantage of the potential of the job market. So I think, to summarize the answer to this question, you're getting the experience right now. It's not a new field because you can incorporate what you've done. If the banking you did during the 6 years was not the only specific functional thing, if the part-time jobs revolved around one other industry, certainly emphasize that as well, because the more bullet points you can have on your resume and the more keywords you can have, the more likely it is that you'll get some positive feedback and actual interest as far as jobs. Next year is a year for growth. The economy is certainly poised to generally grow, and specifically technology and areas dependent on technology have an even brighter future. I think technical writing is something that every creative writer looking to do something outside of academia should consider. And certainly it's something that is going to grow in importance, because the area of technology itself is growing. There are more products, there are more applications and more frameworks, and we need more talented writers to tell the story. Thank you.